Who are you? What are you? Where did you come from? I think you're the cause of all this. I think you're evil! Evil!
It's the Popcorn Digest with Gareth and Andy. Hello and welcome to Popcorn Digest, the podcast about the films you love and some you don't. I'm your host Gareth Green, and joining me as always is my full-time co-host and part-time great tit, Andrew Raphael.
Hanging out with my ball sack.
And today we're watching not one, but two bird-based horrors. One is a thriller by the master of suspense, littered with scenes so iconic they've come to define the genre. And the other is The Birds. That's right, we're watching Hitchcock's classic Pecker and Birdemic's Shock and Terror. But do either of these films soar? Find out after the trailer.
How do you do? My name is Alfred Hitchcock, and I would like to tell you about our good friends, the birds.
That's the damnedest thing I ever saw.
Birds just don't go around attacking people without no reason.
Yes, they attack the children. Attack them. What's the matter with all the birds?
Birds are not aggressive creatures, miss. They bring beauty into the world.
Those gulls attack.
Impossible.
They came in right down the chimney.
Why are they doing things?
It's the end of the world.
Are the birds gonna eat us, Mommy?
Get yourselves guns and wipe them off the face of the earth.
That would hardly be possible.
Mitch, don't!
The 5 continents of the world contain more than 100 billion birds.
Oh, once the birds were everywhere.
Why don't you all go home? Lock your doors and windows.
Did you get the windows in the attic? When do you think they'll come?
What happens if you run out of wood? I don't know.
Today we're doing things a little differently here at Popcorn Digest, as we're taking a look at two full-on peckers. We wanted to review Hitchcock's thriller The Birds, but felt we couldn't really talk about that film without discussing the masterpiece it inspired. After all, the birds ran so that Birdemic, Shock and Terror could fly, before quickly dive-bombing into the nearest petrol station in a ball of flames. And then I wrote, whether or not I keep this one in, Hitchcock must be spinning in his elephant-sized grave.
Oh dear. Yeah, keep that.
Yeah, I felt bad when I wrote it as well. Okay, so yes, I think let's move on to the film. So we're doing both The Birds and Birdemic, and the way it's going to work here is we're going to speak about The Birds first, and then we're going to move on to Birdemic. We don't quite know how this is going to flow, but hopefully it'll all go very pleasantly as a listen.
Yeah, it'll be structured better than Birdemic anyway.
Yeah. Okay, so let's begin with The Birds by the master of suspense. Andy, had you seen The Birds before the episode of Popcorn Digest?
No, not in full, but I've been aware of The Birds from a very young age. And when I was younger, I used to go to Florida a lot, and I used to go to Universal Studios. And in the very early incarnation of that park, they actually where the Shrek ride is now, unfortunately, there was an Alfred Hitchcock based attraction called Alfred Hitchcock: The Art of Filmmaking, or something like that. It had different sections in it. So the first section, I think, was an introduction to Hitchcock, and it had a bit of Dial M for Murder in 3D, so you wore 3D glasses to watch it in 3D.
That was one of my first Hitchcock films, Dial M for Murder.
And then they had a second theatre which you went in, which was the Psycho Theatre, where they reenacted how they did the shower room scene with all the breakaway set. And they had a replica of Bates Motel inside and everything. And then the last part was almost like an interactive museum where they had set pieces, like they had part of the carousel from Strangers on a Train. They had the Statue of Liberty torch from Saboteur, and lots of other things. And they had the model from Rear Window for the back of the street. So I was introduced to Hitchcock and his movies probably from sort of the age of 7 because of this attraction.
Yeah.
And it's long gone. Shrek replaced it years and years ago.
That's
that's almost like a metaphor for where cinema's gone.
Really is.
And yeah, so I've always been aware of The Birds, but just never got around to watching it, I mean, I only really started watching Hitchcock seriously maybe like sort of 5-6 years ago.
Yeah.
I don't know why, I just never got around to it. And I still haven't got through all of them, but yeah, I'm sort of working my way through.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I haven't seen this film fully, but I've been aware of certain set pieces and like the overhead shot with the petrol station on fire and the birds flying over that's always stuck in my mind as my sort of my central image for the birds.
That is one of the best shots in the film as well.
Yeah.
I will say as well, from my point of view, approaching this film, I had not seen it before this episode, and I'm quite a fan of Alfred Hitchcock as well. I started watching his films when I was a teenager, when I just started film school. I remember that DVD box set that they released with the majority of his films, where I have it on Blu-ray now.
Yeah.
They were selling that at HMV for 20 quid, so I bought that.
Yeah.
And over a weekend, I got through a load of his films, and I've been kind of just watching them on repeat since. However, The Birds is just one of those films that it got through the cracks. I never really got round to watching it. I always kind of gravitated towards Psycho as being the film from that era of Alfred Hitchcock that I would go back to. And watching it now, I feel like perhaps I've seen it a little bit too late. And I had a very strange experience with this film because for a good portion of it, I did not get what the fuss was about. And I'll get into why later on in the episode. But it did take a while for it to work its magic on me, to the point that I was really getting ready to be quite negative about the film going into this podcast. But I'll save a little bit back for what we're going to talk about. But yeah, The Birds has also been a later experience for me. I tried to watch it once before, but this is the first time that I've seen it all the way through. But I've always been aware of the legacy of The Birds, obviously.
Yeah.
But to say that I've actually seen Birdemic more times and long before I've seen The Birds is... Well, that's one way that you can shit on the Master of Suspense's legacy as well.
Yeah, I think we saw Birdemic not that long after it had come out, to be honest. I think during that initial media buzz, I do remember around about sort of late 2010, 2011, I was watching it. I mean, I don't think I've seen it since. It doesn't really repair repeated viewing.
No.
Really?
Well,
once is enough.
I have seen Birdemic too many times because I saw it very early when it was first released, and then you go through this period of kind of just showing it to everybody you know that will enjoy that kind of film, that kind of experience in the same way. So you just end up watching it over and over again. And I kind of burnt it out for me. So it's been good to go back to it now and well, I'll say good, and see it in the context of what James Gwen was aping as well. Now that I have the full frame of reference for that.
Yeah, and it is strange with Hitchcock, especially with that box set, which I think has about 16 of his films in. Mm-hmm. I always tended to gravitate towards the black and white films. Actually, yeah, I generally found them to work better for me.
Yeah.
Than the some of the technicolor. I mean, obviously things like Rear Window work, but yeah, I generally just found some of my favorite Hitchcock films are the black and white ones. Like Strangers on a Train and Shadow of a Doubt. Yeah, and ones around that time.
Strangers on a Train was one of the first Hitchcocks I saw. I think Dial M for Murder was the first one I did watch, but then I saw Strangers on a Train, and that's left a very lasting impact on me as a film as well. Always very much enjoyed that one.
Bar a few exceptions, I tend to favour the more black and white ones over the colours.
Yeah.
That sounds really wrong. Anyway, and I hadn't really visited the latter part of his career, like, you know, post-Psycho.
Yeah.
I'm only just starting to sort of visit that now. I'm sort of going through sort of like Topaz and Torn Curtain and Frenzy. And because The Birds is post-Psycho, it kind of is lumped in with all that. So I just haven't really got around to experiencing it until now. And I think it was like a month or two ago, I was watching the Hitchcock Truffaut documentary. Yeah. And when they started talking about The Birds, I just thought, oh, that would be a good one to do. And then you had the idea of pairing it with Birdemic. So I was wanting to do this sort of arty piece episode on The Birds. And then
I wanted to keep us grounded.
Yeah, grounded. My flight of fancy.
Exactly, yeah.
But yeah, it's funny because you started watching the film before I did, and you texted me about it saying that you didn't think it was that great.
No.
And I watched it last night in the knowledge that you didn't like it. I didn't actually know that you hadn't seen the whole thing.
Yeah.
So I was watching it in the knowledge that you hated the whole thing.
Yeah.
Because you really didn't talk very positively about it at all in your text message. So I kind of watched it with that. And I'm not sure that it's because of that I had a slightly better experience with it than just watching it completely cold without any kind of prior opinion. But yeah, I do completely understand where you're coming from, because it is, I would say it is comes under the category of flawed masterwork. It is not a perfect film.
Yeah. I mean, I did text you far too prematurely when I was watching that film, because I'd only seen about an hour and 15 minutes of it. So I had started watching it late at night, and I was finding it really quite hard to get through because I have a 4-month-old as well that I have to attend to as well in the middle of the night. So sleep is something that I'm like only getting in fits and starts. So I was finding it quite hard to get through that first chunk of the film, and I wasn't feeling any sense of tension or growing sense of panic or anything like that. And I kind of gave up on it at the point in which the kids are running down the street with the birds chasing them. And I genuinely thought at that point, oh, it's near the end. And when I paused it, I saw, oh shit, no, there's 50 minutes to go. So I left that there, and I thought I'll come back to it later and then I'll text you. And I really was in a negative place at that point. But then having seen the rest of it, I gave it another go and I watched it from scratch again, and I really went straight through it. And watching it all in one go the second time around as well, it worked so much better for me, but mainly because of what it does in that second half.
Yeah.
Like, I do feel like the first half is a slog that you have to get through to where Hitchcock excels in the second half. I think as well, just before we do get into really the nitty gritty as to what really worked and didn't work for us, I think it's important that we do lay some context in regards to the birds as well, like when this film was made. Now, Andy, I haven't actually done any of the any background stuff, but you've watched a couple of documentaries about the birds.
Yeah.
So would you be able to like set the scene for ourselves as to when this film was made?
Yeah. So this is the first film that Hitchcock made following his phenomenal success with Psycho. It's probably the longest gap after a film in his whole filmography up until that point anyway, because it comes out almost a full 3 years after Psycho. So I'm not sure whether it was a problem with getting stories, because I know that was always a problem with Hitchcock, is finding new and interesting stories. And I imagine at this point in his career, because he'd done so many films, that it would have gotten harder and harder to find a unique story. But the genesis for The Birds comes from a short story by Daphne du Maurier, who'd written Rebecca.
Of course, yeah.
It was originally optioned to be an episode of his television show, Alfred Hitchcock Presents. Through perusing story concepts for the TV show, he'd come across this and actually thought it may make a decent stepping off point for a feature rather than a TV episode. He contacted screenwriter Evan Hunter with the idea of using the central conceit of birds attacking a small town, but pretty much throwing everything else out, because I think the short story was more of a mood piece and was set in a Cornish town in the UK. And he wanted to obviously shift the action to America.
Understandably.
And I think they chose Bodega Bay specifically because of the weather, which had much more in common with a British climate. If you like, the landscape feels very, if you weren't told, you would have thought you would have been in England or something like that. Because it had very unpredictable weather, a lot of rain and wind, and it definitely shaped the landscape into something that was definitely more recognizable. If someone had said that was Cornwall,
the only thing that gives it away is like the structures of the houses.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, you could easily put a little Cornish town there.
Yeah, well, it could be somewhere in Scotland or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, that was the central idea. And going into, actually, maybe this is almost like the start of maybe the issues that you have with the film. Evan Hunter had the idea of doing almost like a mashup, because the original piece was a mood piece and they were trying to work out how to get these characters involved into this situation. He purposely designed the front end of the film to be a 1940s style screwball comedy with a meet cute involved, and that will be what spurred these characters into action and get them to that location. And the idea is that in the 1940s screwball comedies, it was very often the idea that you would have the high society lady and then the more stoic man who would be a lawyer, which is why they are those archetype characters.
Yeah.
And then dump them in that situation and then let it slowly evolve. This is kind of unusual because obviously most directors embarking on a story, if they thought that the story would require certain technical obstacles to overcome, they would maybe assess this before embarking on the project. But Hitchcock, being Hitchcock, with his general attitude towards things, would be, I'm not going to test any technologies before doing this film. We've got a sort of let's get on with it attitude. So we're going to make it work, whatever.
Yeah, like learn it on the fly.
Yeah, which is a very kind of old school attitude.
Yeah, it is.
Something you wouldn't really get away with now because obviously at this particular time in his history, he had an incredible amount of power within the Universal City lot. I think he was the fifth largest shareholder in
man in the
Universal
world
at that time. Yeah. So, as usual with a Hitchcock film, the film was pre-planned to the nth degree with a hell of a lot of storyboarding, which is commonplace now, but was not commonplace at all at the time. He was like invented the concept of pre-visualization. The production of the film is actually pretty effects intensive, like more, and actually we're going through the documentary that's on the DVD, because I haven't got the Blu-ray, but I think it's on the Blu-ray anyway. But the All About the Birds documentary, there's things in that I just did not know were not real, because obviously Hitchcock has a penchant for not filming on location. He was famously hated filming anything on location due to the lack of control. Only a very small part of this film was actually made in Bodega Bay. A lot of the film was achieved on the backlot and in sound stages, and a lot of the blanks were filled in by using matte paintings.
Yeah.
And a hell of a lot of matte paintings. Some that I did not know were matte paintings. It's our...
No, I will say that I did feel like there's some obvious soundstage stuff, as there always is in Alfred Hitchcock films, but I did think that this film did shoot primarily on location, especially for the exteriors.
Yeah.
So that's quite a revelation for myself as well.
So the majority of the town scenes are done on the backlot. Even some of the scenes on the open water were enhanced with matte shots.
Yeah.
And that overhead shot that we were talking about before was mainly achieved using a matte painting. For example, with that shot, they set the camera up on the hill, which now famously is the location for the Universal Studios Hollywood theme park.
Yeah.
And they had the camera pointing down onto the backlot car park. The scene was set up there, and they had the fire and people running around, and they basically marked it off on a pane of glass. So they created an in-camera matte.
Yeah.
And then Albert Whitlock, who was the matte artist on the film, all the buildings and the surrounding countryside is all a matte painting.
Oh, wow.
And then the birds were added on afterwards.
That's quite marvellous.
And it's all in camera, so it's like an in-camera negative, so it wouldn't have been developed until the last minute. So you've got all those kind of techniques. But the main thing with the film, which I think maybe why it stands the test of time more so than other films that are optically composited, they used a special technique to do all of the optical work. So instead of using a blue screen and doing mattes that way, they used a special sodium process, which had been patented by Disney.
Of course.
And was invented by Ub Iwerks, who's I would say a figure who's just not talked about enough.
Yeah.
He was a very early colleague of Walt Disney. He was the first man to animate Mickey Mouse. He animated all those very early Mickey Mouse shorts like Steamboat Willie and Playing Crazy and everything. And then later on, he became head of special processes at Disney Productions and invented things like the multiplane camera, Xeroxing, which is obviously, he basically invented photocopying.
Wow.
And he invented the sodium process, which basically meant instead of having a blue screen, they had this yellow screen. And it was the difference between white light and yellow light, but there was nothing backlit. So you wouldn't get that kind of like blue halo that you would get around. So it meant that there were pretty much no matte lines.
Oh, very nice.
Which, you used to get that black line. So they actually had Disney do this work for them, because obviously it was Disney's process and they weren't going to share it with anyone else. So Disney was sort of seconded to do these optical effects using this sodium process. That's the reason why, even after all this time, the effects look pretty good.
Yeah.
There's a few effects where you can kind of tell that, yeah, they've processed this optically, but there's quite a lot of shots in the film that I had no idea that they'd actually put the birds in afterwards.
Yeah.
Especially that scene with the sparrows inside the house when they come inside the house. That is
incredibly effective. That's one of my favourite scenes in the entire film, to be honest.
That's all optical. They were reacting against nothing.
See, I was trying to figure that out while I was watching it, because I could see that there was something optical going on, but it still felt like there was something physically there. It all came together so well for that scene that to actually learn that the whole lot of it was optical is quite astounding now, because some of it is just seamless.
I think also as well, this is one of the rare films, and I was reading about this in the Hitchcock Truffaut book just before. This is one of the very rare films where he kind of improvised on set as well, with a few sequences, because he kind of felt that the scenario wasn't holding up, so he did make a few changes on the fly. There's two major aspects to this film, I think, that are in addition to the effects. One is the music, or lack of music.
I've written in my notes as well the distinct lack of music.
Yeah.
It does give it this stark terror feeling to it as well.
This is a very early example of electronic sound manipulation. Remy Gassman, and they had this sound manipulator synthesizer MacGuffin malarkey called the Tritonium.
Yeah.
And it allowed them to manipulate audio sounds. Although he's not credited as composer, Bernard Herrmann was involved in orchestrating all these sounds. So in all intents and purposes, it still is a Bernard Herrmann score, but it's a score using sound effects rather than...
That was what I was going to mention, is that although it doesn't have a score itself, it does feel like the birds themselves provide this kind of atonal, terrifying soundtrack that enhances the picture.
Yeah.
And it's clear that this was obviously the case, but that the conscious decision was made for the birds themselves to be the soundtrack to the picture. So having Bernard Herrmann in there as well, somebody with a musical background to kind of know when these birds need to hit these typical beats as well, and when to hit them. The film does have that sense of flow, even though it doesn't have anything traditionally musical going on in that background.
And there's a little bit of source music as well, like you have the kids singing during the scene where she's sitting on the bench and the crows are gathering behind her on the jungle gym.
I just got to ask as well, during that scene, have you written down the big train gag? Because I cannot watch that scene without thinking of the sketch from Big Train with all of the working man builders turning up. It's a brilliant sketch. It can be watched on YouTube, but it's essentially that scene played out, but instead of birds turning up on a jungle gym, it's just these working class builders that are just going, hello, all right, mate, hello, 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 all right, mate, hello. And every time you look back, there's more of them just hanging off the jungle gym and everything. Hello, all right, mate, hello, all right.
I'd actually forgotten about that sketch. And there's an incredible use of silence in this film, especially in the second half of the film.
Yeah.
In the last half an hour. And I'd say that's probably where the film is at its most effective, in that last half an hour.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're into sound in movies, was one of the ones to watch, I would say.
Yeah.
That last half an hour of the birds. But the other main thing to talk about, I think, with this film, I'd say maybe the film's Achilles heel, but is the cast. Because post-Psycho, The Birds is the first film where you have a sense that the wheels are slowly starting to fall off the cart for the Hitchcock train, because from this point onwards, he starts losing people. And later on, that went for his composer, Bernard Herrmann, his DOP, his costume designer.
Yeah.
The list goes on.
And then you have really ending with Frenzy, which is practically a film made with an entirely different cast and crew.
Yeah.
He couldn't even get the people that he wanted for that film, for the roles that he wanted to populate them within that film.
At this point, the people that he was losing from the start was his cast members. Because at this point, a lot of the people that he'd used in the past were either getting too old. I know that Hitchcock attributed the failure of Vertigo to the age of James Stewart.
Yeah.
And Cary Grant famously retired very early on in his career, not that long after North by Northwest.
I was going to say, Rod Taylor has a very Cary Grantness term as well, that I feel like that's the role that he occupies.
Do you know what I think about Rod Taylor?
Go on.
That Rod Taylor looks like Cary Grant had sex with Robin Williams.
I can see it. Yeah, I can. And also, that is an image that will never leave my brain.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Andy.
I was thinking it all the way through the films. Like,
I wouldn't want to traverse through your brain.
yeah, he looks like Robin Williams, like channeling Cary Grant.
Just slightly less hairier.
Yeah. But yeah, he was losing a lot of these people. And also, in his leading ladies, he had very particular ideas about what a leading lady and a leading man should be. And the people that he used time and time again, like Cary Grant, James Stewart, and they are either retired or were too old. And people like Grace Kelly, who was his ideal leading lady, had by this point gone off to marry the Prince of Monaco and become Monaco royalty. And I know that he did try and get her back for the following film, Marnie, but I know there was a whole political ruckus with Charles de Gaulle and the Prince of Monaco. It basically ended up that she couldn't revisit her film career. Yeah. All these people he just wasn't able to use.
Special about
so he
that.
ended up having to resort to using people like Rod Taylor, who he felt were competent but did not have the same charisma that those earlier actors did.
I do like Rod Taylor as well, but primarily from The Time Machine.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't say that he's the greatest of that period, which Alfred Hitchcock was used to working with. He was used to working with the best of the best. And I do think in this film, Rod Taylor is who you would describe as an actor that is, as you mentioned, competent. He's fine. But there's nothing really...
But I'd say this search for the ideal leading lady brings us on to Tippi Hedren, who is the lead of this film.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is a strange case, I would say. This is almost like life imitating art. I would say this is like Vertigo come real.
Yeah.
I mean, there's been an awful lot written about this Alfred Hitchcock-Tippi Hedren relationship. I mean, there's a whole film, The Girl, that was made about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is Hitchcock's attempt at taking somebody and moulding them into his ideal leading lady.
Yeah.
And it lasted all of 2 films. I mean, this film and Marnie, which I think, is another story entirely, and there's much that's been written in about its aftermath, and I'm never quite sure what is true and what isn't with that.
Tippi Hedren's been quite vocal as to what happened on set, especially when it comes to The Birds, and how Hitchcock tortured her once she rebuffed his sexual advances. And I know there's been people that have come forward to say that she's a liar, but I do remember reading that Rod Taylor was somebody that did jump to her defense, as somebody that actually saw it on set as well and witnessed that. And I do feel like at this point in Hitchcock's career, especially, as you mentioned, the wheels are coming off the car, I do feel like this is where somebody that's used to getting everything that he's ever wanted suddenly finds that he can't. I put so much more stock into Tippi Hedren's version of events than I do otherwise, essentially. I do think there's something about him that is gross as a person kind of thing from this point onwards that it's hard to deny.
Yeah, but I think the thing that makes it more complicated, unlike a lot of these more modern sort of Me Too situations, is that she almost has like a love-hate relationship with Hitchcock.
Yeah.
Even after all that happened and the fact that he basically sabotaged her career after Marnie, she still has a certain degree of admiration for him.
And respect for him.
And and it's one of the things where you'll never get down to the bottom of it. But it's definitely...
No, I don't think
it's
so.
It's definitely one of those things where it's definitely a Hitchcock losing perspective, trying to hold on to things. And almost like, because she ended up being his kind of plaything, his thing to mold.
Yeah.
It was almost a sense of ownership.
That sense of control. Yeah. Yeah, there's plenty been written about it. There's plenty that you can read and even watch about the subject as well.
But for our middle-aged listeners, she is the mum of Melanie Griffith.
Of course.
And for our younger listeners, she's the grandma of Dakota Johnson.
There we go.
So a long dynasty there.
Absolutely. I do remember reading that Melanie Griffiths has a story about Alfred Hitchcock saying that he presented her with a little model of a coffin with Tippi Hedren inside it as a present to give to Melanie Griffiths. At the time, she was 7 years old. That's pretty terrifying.
Yeah.
And also, this is pre-Raw, which is a film that we should definitely do on this podcast.
Yeah. Tentatively casting that aside, because it is like a big elephant in the room, and it kind of does cast a bit of a shadow across all of Hitchcock's work, I would say.
Yeah, if you do get into it, the whole podcast episode would be about that particular subject. And there's certainly a lot that you could talk about. So many different moral things that you could bring up as well about the subject. But I think there's other people out there that could do that particular thing better than us.
Yeah. The point of it all really is the fact that I don't think you can mold somebody to be something that just comes natural to another person. I think trying to get somewhere in between Ingrid Bergman, who he never forgave for leaving him for Rossellini, and Grace Kelly. Like, he was definitely trying to get somebody who was somewhere in between. I don't think you can mold somebody into that.
Yeah, I think Grace Kelly he described as being like his shining star.
Yeah.
And he really liked her because she could tell a good dirty joke and swore like a trooper.
And I think with Grace Kelly, it just shows on screen that it's just something that comes natural to her.
Yeah.
She's not doing anything particular. That's just her. And, the same goes with Cary Grant. And that's why, if you watch, say, something like To Catch a Thief, their chemistry is just like popping off the screen.
Oh, yeah. It's fire.
And I think in a way with the Birds, there's almost like an attempt to revisit that feeling. Because I watched To Catch a Thief not that long ago. And the early part of this film very much reminded me of the dynamic in To Catch a Thief.
Yeah.
But them failing at doing that. And I think this is where I feel like maybe the film's Achilles heel is in its central casting, because I think to set up this meet-cute situation, it may have worked with Cary Grant and Grace Kelly.
Grace Kelly, yeah.
But I don't think it works with these actors.
No, because there are no fireworks between them.
No.
I think for one reason or another, and I think from what you've just said as well, to take an actress and try and make them fit another mold rather than allowing them to be themselves and accentuating what they bring to a film and taking it that way, I think that already is a wrong direction to head in. But you certainly, for one reason or another, don't have any fireworks between these characters. There's no friction or sexual tension or anything like that between these characters. And I think this is why I keep on referring to it as the Breakfast at Tiffany's part of the film. But it, like you say, it's that screwball comedy aspect. And I think with Tippi Hedren's character, Melanie Daniels, she's often described as being this free spirit, this wild individual. And what she does at the beginning of the film, taking these lovebirds to, I forgot his name, is it Mitch?
Mitch
Brenner? Mitch Brenner. Taking them across 60 miles of Californian land to drop them off at his doorstep. Like, that's the wildest thing that she's done, but never again do we ever feel like there's anything kooky or crazy about her as a character. She's a lot more stoic and a lot more rigid than we really expect of these type of films.
And I think because of that whole aspect of the story comes off as a little bit kind of borderline obsessive rather than free-spirited. Yeah. It kind of comes off the wrong way.
I wrote down that it comes across as pre-bunny boiler.
Oh, totally,
Like, this is definitely
Fatal
something
Attraction.
that a character from Fatal Attraction would do, most certainly.
Yeah, it just seems like, when we were watching the film, like, my wife was just she's going above and beyond what any normal person would do. And I think it's because of that kind of, she has a kind of prickliness that you don't get with, say, someone like Grace Kelly, that I think, it sort of puts that whole part of the story slightly off kilter. And I think, instead of trying to mold her into that, they should have gone with what worked for her and built the story around her if you wanted her to be in the film. Because, making her do that kind of stuff, and again, making Rod Taylor do that kind of stuff, it just doesn't really work.
No.
Yeah, I'd say that part of the film feels quite long-winded as well because of it, because you're not on board with it. It just feels like, come on, let's go up to the birds. I mean, so probably a full half an hour until anything bird-related happens at all.
And that's the thing with the film as well that Alfred Hitchcock said about the film was that everybody going into it, going to see it, would know that the birds would be an element of the film. And so the tension comes from, when do they start? When do they start to attack? But that whole part goes on for so long that by the time that they do, you're looking forward to them attacking.
Yeah.
So that something happens. That's the issue for me, is I'm not dreading the fact that these birds are going to start attacking at some point. I'm genuinely looking forward to it just so that it kicks this film off into another level. It takes it somewhere else, because what it does in that first 45 minutes doesn't work for me.
And also, I think because the titles build up to it, like they kind of get you prepared for it, and then there's nothing. Like, there's not even
No, it just pulls you straight back again.
I mean, you get slight hints, but I don't think it's enough to build up that anticipation.
No, I mean, at one part at the beginning is where, like you say, about half an hour in, she gets attacked by a seagull. That happened to my dad on a run in Wales. That's not incredibly unusual.
Yeah, and if you go to St. Ives in any day, like those seagulls are vicious. I had a seagull once that when I was there, it nicked my whole pasty. So I had this huge pasty.
Just an entire Greg's sausage roll going down the gullet.
I had like a steak and Stilton pasty, and I had and this seagull swooped down, whacked me in the face, and stole the whole bloody thing. I mean, and this thing's heavy. Like, it's a heavy pasty. I ended up with like a little corner. That's all I had left.
That made me laugh about the beginning of the film because everybody's like, oh, the birds don't normally attack like this. I was like, have you ever been to fucking Blackpool?
Yeah.
It's like, it's all that they do. They're horrible.
Yeah.
I remember when we went to Wales as a kid, my dad used to go running every single morning while we were staying there. And there used to be one single seagull that used to just sit on one of the nearby houses. And the moment he would start running, it would just start dive bombing him for the entire run. He'd be out for half an hour, and he said and did it every single morning. You got all these people that live in this fishing village saying, like, the birds don't normally act this way. Yeah, they fucking do, the birds. So I have some minor issues with this setup.
And also, I feel like they're hinting it with the relationship of the Brenners. I feel like they're hinting at something quite interesting that they never really get a handle on as well. This whole mother-son relationship between Rod Taylor and Jessica Tandy, who I actually wrote down looks far too young to be his mum. But when I looked up the ages, she's a full 21 years older than him.
Really?
Yeah. Like, she looks really good. She was born in 1909 and he's born in 1930. So she's legitimately old enough to be his mum, but she did not look.
I wrote that she was too young.
Yeah.
And I said, because she looks too young, their relationship almost comes off as incestuous.
Yeah. I think it's because Rod Taylor looks older than he is. She looks younger than she is.
Oh, wow. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, she was looking good.
Yes, she was.
I thought they'd just grayed her hair up or something, like, to make her look older. The whole relationship between Annie.
Yeah, Annie Hayworth,
yeah. I found that kind of odd and quite intriguing, but I don't think they really delved enough into it. Apparently that Annie Hayworth character is a remnant of what the original lead character was supposed to be like.
Yeah.
I think the original draft, they had the leading lady as a school teacher who had moved into the town to be close to someone that she loved but had been rebuffed.
Yeah.
Which I don't know why they didn't use that. Seems a much more natural inlet. I don't know why they abandoned that, but that's what, and they basically made that character as a secondary character who would be the sacrificial lamb of the film.
Yeah, I found her death as well to be quite anticlimactic.
Yeah,
because I know it's off screen anyway, and there's only so much that you can show. But after setting up that character so hard in that first couple of acts, it then kind of goes nowhere and just fizzles out more than anything.
Yeah, I
and
definitely
I thought that the actress was great, although she sounds like she's about 20 years older than she looks.
Yeah, I couldn't quite work her out, to be honest. It was a bit odd. I mean, there was definitely something off kilter about the whole situation, to be honest.
I felt like she was there as well to be this part of the love triangle that it does set up in that. But because I don't think it really fully commits to it either. It keeps on hinting at there being a love triangle there, but then pulling away from it. And because of that lack of commitment as well, like I say, I feel like that first hour of the film, it's lacking real drive.
Yeah.
It's just kind of like meandering as it goes. And because there's no pop or fizzle between the characters as well, there's a sense of waiting, but without any tension as well.
Yeah.
That was why I had such a negative experience that first time around as well. And it didn't help that my viewing experience was interrupted a couple of times and I kept going back to it as well because it couldn't really build anything during that kind of watch. But yeah, I just felt it was lacking any fizz.
Yeah, and I do feel like the dialogue is a bit stilted at times, especially in the first hour.
And I read from Hitchcock that one of the things that he wanted to do initially with the film as well, with regards to the birds, and I don't know if this is something that is in reference to Daphne du Maurier's original short story, is that he wanted the birds to represent a punishment for some secret that this town has held for so many years, and now the birds are coming to punish them. They're like a thematic representation of their guilt. And when I read that, I was like, oh, I know it's probably a little bit more cliche and probably what he was going for with this film is that it's the fact that the birds don't represent anything at all that makes them terrifying, because they can, it can happen to anybody. But also, I don't feel like it comes together in a more kind of cohesive role. It makes me think that the first hour of the film was kind of useless, and it doesn't really justify why it went on for so long without anything actually happening, because the birds don't actually represent anything like that.
Yeah.
Like, there's no mystery that's slowly unraveling outside of the birds themselves, or anything, any story-driven purpose to the narrative. I just don't know where it's going for that first hour.
Yeah, and when I was watching that part of the film, I thought, oh, is this setting up certain members of the town that are going to be featured later? And it doesn't really do that either. I think there's something interesting in there, but it's just, it gets lost within.
Yeah,
I don't know. It's just not executed particularly well. To be honest, the thing I found with this film is that although when it works, it really works.
Yeah.
When you get to the actual bird horror aspect to the film, it works.
Yeah,
it works hard,
terrifying.
But in any of the in between sections, I feel like Hitchcock is actually having an off day. And one of these scenes, which I really didn't think worked that well. And reading the Hitchcock Truffaut book, Francois Truffaut actually picks up on this as well. He actually mentions this to Hitchcock, because I think the great thing about the Hitchcock Truffaut book is that Truffaut he's never hesitant in criticizing things that he doesn't think works in his work. He's quite
brutally honest.
He's brutally honest with him, which I think Hitchcock appreciated, actually. He had serious reservations about the restaurant scene, about the cafe scene, about saying that it went on far too long. And I would wholeheartedly agree with him. And the strange thing is that the writer thought that was one of his best scenes, and I think actually almost like epitomized why Evan Hunter is not Alfred Hitchcock. And I just think for a Hitchcock film is far too verbose. And I think the staging of it is, there's a couple of little moments which work, but I think it's actually quite conventionally staged.
Yeah, I would say what works about it is I like the sense that there's things going on in this environment, like people are talking over each other, people are interrupting each other, but you do feel like there's far too many characters there. They all like have far too much information for what they're providing as well. You have this ornithological expert lady that kind of walks in and just doles out all of this crazy information during the entire scene as well. And they kind of try and mask it by having her interrupted several times, but you can kind of tell that that's what she's there for, is to provide another kind of aspect, another kind of point of view for the film as well. And yeah, I got the feeling when I was watching that, I actually wrote that this feels like it's littered with cardboard cutout Hitchcock characters, not fully fleshed Hitchcock characters. Like, it feels like it's somebody that's seen a Hitchcock film and then is saying, oh, I'm going to do a scene like a Hitchcock scene with these type of characters, and then wrote that but never really fleshed it out truly.
Yeah, it just felt really flat for me, and it felt quite cliched as well, especially with the sort of Irish sounding guy going, it's the end of the world, and it's like, oh no.
That was the one that got me as well, because I already feel like when this film works as well, especially on the second half, it already has this apocalyptic feel to it. It doesn't need somebody to literally come out and say it's the end of the world, because it already feels like really oppressively apocalyptic, especially with the final shot.
I mean, I think even in the best Hitchcock films, there's sometimes you have that scene which sticks out and doesn't really work. I mean, like the ending of Frenzy is incredibly lackluster considering what's happening in the rest of the film. And the other one is, the other famous one I think is the one of the last scenes in Psycho, where you have this random psychiatrist guy basically talks for a full 5 minutes spouting exposition that we pretty much already know, and it's just not necessary at all. You could have cut that scene out, actually.
I love Psycho, but that is a film that goes on about 5 minutes too long.
Yeah, and it's just
it's just nearly there.
And it's like, oh, that's the scene for the dummies.
Yeah.
The scene immediately after is great, but that scene in the middle is just guff.
It is.
It just doesn't need to be there.
It feels like it's there to appease somebody as well.
Yeah.
Like it's there to like a studio's come in and said, we really need to tie this up in a bow that really makes the rest of the film easily digestible for the audience, so they can walk away and say that they got everything.
Yeah.
And it's entirely unnecessary.
And I feel that cafe scene is a similar deal, where it's very exposition heavy and it just slows the whole thing down. And I don't think it really successfully replicates the paranoia of the town either, because it's so clunkily executed. It's made up like 2 minutes later by the whole petrol station set piece, which is fantastic. But that bit leading up is just a real slog. Even if the rest of the film leading up had been really great, they still had that cafe scene. It would have stuck out like a sore thumb.
It would have. In fact, it was the cafe scene where I had initially turned it off the first time around and thought I will come back to this. And what a time to turn it off, because it's from the petrol station scene where like everything kicks off to that second level. And from there till the end, I think the film it works gangbusters. I mean, the scenes before that as well that really work, like isolated scenes, but it's because it's part of that. It's part of a different film, essentially. Like, having mentioned Psycho, I think it's important that we do bring that into the discussion, because I do feel like this film structurally is Psycho repeated, but allowed to kind of meander a bit. It's like Psycho, but nowhere near as tight. And the thing that works about Psycho, I get with The Birds that what he's trying to do is the first half of the film is another film entirely, and then the birds invade that film, and that's what makes it terrifying. I get that. And Psycho did the same, but instead of the birds, it had Norman Bates. But the thing that works about Psycho was the Marion section of the story works on its own. That is a film that I would want to see regardless of Norman Bates' introduction and invasion of that film. I want to see that Marion story play out. And that's what makes that film work, is that Norman Bates interrupts that story, kills our lead. We suddenly don't know where we are and don't know where this is going. With The Birds, because I don't care about that first half of the film, there are other films that do the screwball comedy element better, Philadelphia Story, Breakfast at Tiffany's, all that kind of thing. It works so much better when it's about the birds. I even feel like on a repeat viewing, it's just like biding your time to get to the birds. And it kind of, because that beginning is weak and it isn't a film that I want to see on its own, it undercuts really what it does so well in the second half for me.
And I think you even get that from Hitchcock himself. It was almost like, don't worry, they're coming sort of thing.
Yeah.
But it's like, it's not really good enough. I think what they should have done is thrown out the meet cute plot and started that again if they were going to structure it like that, because it just doesn't work really. Well, it doesn't work with those cast members anyway and that dialogue. And because that's the thing about Psycho, is that it holds up so well, like even nowadays, to any sort of first-time viewer, it's going to work because the A plot works so well, and then when it's hijacked by the B plot, it's still very surprising. I watched it not that long ago with Jess, and she'd never seen it, and it took her by surprise. I mean, she knew that the shower scene was coming, because obviously everyone does these days. I mean, I can't imagine what it would have been like watching it for the first time cold. That would have been incredible, because you're so wrapped up in that initial plot, and following her, it works ridiculously well. And if it wasn't for that stupid scene at the end, it would be a completely perfect film.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a perfect film with a dodgy scene. That's all it is, really.
It is, yeah. And I also think as well, we do get a scene in The Birds with Melanie Daniels stuck inside the phone box, which is his retake of the shower scene as well. Like the way that that's cut and the way... I love the editing. That whole petrol station scene, the way that plays out, the way that it's edited. And again, no music, but you still feel like there's a sense of rhythm to everything that's happening, because you've got that kind of like musical background in the sound design. It just works for me. That whole sequence is pure terror as well. Like the build up, the payoff, it all works.
I mean, the visual effects in that are brilliant as well. The fact that the phone box is in a studio and it's all either process or like matte. There's a lot of matte paintings in that as well. Mechanical birds, real birds. Yeah, I know that when that bird crashes through the glass, that glass shatters through, and actually ended up like loads of bits ended up in her face. They spent the rest of the afternoon picking out bits of glass from her face. Yeah, she went through the ringer on that. Like that whole end scene is all real birds. Yeah. It was 5 days apparently that they shot that sequence in.
Yeah, watching that scene, it made me feel a little bit breathless as well. Like it kind of made me feel a little bit sweaty palmed and claustrophobic. And it's one of those scenes where I'm like, it works probably because, and it's horrible to say that you know that there's a real person being tortured during this scene, but that's also what it makes it a despicable scene.
Yeah.
This shouldn't have to do this for a film.
Yeah.
But it does have this kind of like sweaty palmed nervousness to it, anxiety to it that scene works brilliantly.
Yeah, it is kind of part of that auteur director control that's fast becoming out of fashion these days.
Definitely.
Like,
definitely.
It's right up there with the Quentin Tarantino strangling scene.
Yes.
I mean, that's the fact that Tippi Hedren was so exhausted the week after, because they did it basically a Monday to Friday jobby, that even like the following Monday, she was called to the set and just could not get up. So the whole sequence where she's carried down the stairs and laid down, that's all a body double.
Oh, really?
And they just put inserts of close-ups afterwards because she wasn't functioning at all. I think it seemed like they shot quite a lot of the film in order.
And speaking about that ending as well, one of the things that I actually wrote down in my notes, because in this film we do get a very young Veronica Cartwright as well, in a very prominent role. But I've actually written in my notes that she started crying in this film and didn't stop for the next 40 years of acting.
Yeah, I was thinking that as well. Like, yeah, she's really good at crying. No wonder she got typecast.
She nails it. She really does.
Yeah.
But also about that ending, about where the film builds to, because it essentially leaves us off with the final act as being this siege. And it feels like a zombie movie, like a proto-zombie film. And when I was watching it, I was like, well, you wouldn't have Night of the Living Dead, which actually came a few years later, without the birds, actually. And in fact, there's one prominent shot that's paid homage to by Shaun of the Dead. When Rod Taylor, his hand has been bitten by the bird, so he goes into the back room to bandage himself, and there's a shot of him walking into a room to the left of frame, whereas we can see the back door where all the beaks are poking through, and he doesn't realise it. And that is paid off in Shaun of the Dead, where
in the Winchester,
with the Winchester with the light on in the back room, and I thought even the framing of it is perfect, and I've never noticed that before. It's fantastic.
Yeah,
I like that about Shaun of the Dead. Is that
that's just Edgar Wright anyway? He knows how to He knows how to do movie tributes without you knowing. I liked I didn't like it because knowing how they did it is pretty bad, to be honest. But like the whole bird attack on Tippi Hedren at the end is effective, but at the same time it's quite dumb, because I'm just like, why would you open that door?
Yeah.
It did feel like, again, very slasher. But I felt that the siege on the house was much more effective in a way, because it relied more on sound effects rather than actually seeing anything.
It is, and the best scene with the siege is the one in which the birds just begin to make their noise.
Yeah.
And everybody kind of like retreats to different parts of the house to find refuge, and it's just a noise. We don't even see them. This is before the attack. It's almost like a call to arms for the birds, and that was like, I got goosebumps watching that. I remember texting you the other night and saying, there's just no tension to this film. And after that, I was like, oh my God, my heart.
And apparently they did that using a drum as well. So obviously there's no sound on the set for, bird sounds anyway.
Of course, yeah.
What they did, like, they just let the scene play out. But what they'd have this drummer behind the camera who would obviously start playing his drum really quiet. And then as time got on, he'd start hitting it harder and harder and harder.
Nice.
So it got to like deafening. And that's how they got the sort of the ramping it up, like for the actors.
That's good. I like that.
Like a really low tech way of doing it.
Yeah, absolutely.
The last shot in the film is made up of 32 separate pieces of film.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they were limited to how many seagulls they could use.
The seagulls are very well behaved. I watched that and I thought, those seagulls, he's like kicking them out of the way as he's walking by, just slowly nudging them. It's like very well behaved and well trained seagulls.
But yeah, they had the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals on set at all times.
I'm glad to hear that, because I did write, at times it feels like Alfred Hitchcock is just pelting people with birds.
There was a lot of trained birds and like different bird wranglers. I think the bird wrangler was called like Ray Bowick. Yeah, and especially like the crows, who were, apparently there was a lot of different trained crows that could do different things. Like they were so well trained that they couldn't be released to the wild because they were like trained to like swoop down on you and things like that. And some of the crows were quite friendly, but others were not.
Yeah. That final scene is great, but I kind of ruined it for myself. One of the thoughts that popped into my head, because even when I was watching at that point, I was like, I do feel like the birds should mean something. Like it it would be better if it like played more into what the A plot, the beginning was. Like if they just even vaguely represented something that we could tie it to that beginning. Because at least with Psycho, you can say, well, Norman Bates, he's a very gross and perverse punishment to Marion for her committing this act. It's, it's not justice or anything like that you would call that, but you say the slasher film rules, she gets killed because she does something wrong. And in this film, it's like, I don't feel like the birds represent anything in the lives of these characters other than birds, attacking birds. And so I was like, it would be good if we just had just the slightest inkling as to why. And I had this thought of, as the car's leaving town, they pass a sign that says, "Welcome to Bodega Bay, home of the world's largest seed bell." And it's like, that's the punchline. That's the punchline for the whole thing. Suddenly you understand why.
I mean, I think there's a couple of things that I kind of picked up on that I'm not sure are intentional or just something that I've read. Because I know in the documentary they talk about the phone booth scene and it being a parallel to the start of the film when Mitch puts the bird back in the cage in the bird shop and like put you back in your gilded cage, and the phone booth is supposed to represent her being in a cage.
Okay.
And also like that whole kind of sort of like witch hunt thing that goes on in the cafe later on, which is actually, I'd say, is much more effective than the cafe scene before.
Yeah.
When they're all huddled in that back corridor.
Yeah, and that woman comes forward and blames her and said that you brought this to us. That's the point where I thought we were going to start getting the thematic understanding as to what the birds represent. Like, I even wrote at some point, is it the birds, do they represent grief and loss? Because you have Tippi Hedren's character, Melanie's lost her mother, and then you have Mrs. Brenner has lost her husband, and she talks about this feeling of grief, and how it finds you and leaves you exhausted, and it can attack you at any time, and this kind of thing. I was like, maybe the birds represent that, but it never really comes to pay off in any way.
I also got almost like something that would have been pressed it in the time, like a small town paranoia, almost like a communist thing, like alternate ideology, like the fact that she's this is a small conservative town and that she's from the city, and it's like
she represents progress and like liberal mindedness.
The fact that she's reckless, and there's the whole subplot of her being naked in Rome and things like that, and she's like bringing this plague upon them, and it's like.
Yeah.
I think it would have worked better if they'd had that character of Annie be the lead and that she was from the city and she set herself up as a school teacher to be near this guy. I think it would have been a much more streamlined plot if that had been the case.
Especially because by like the hour mark, they treat Melanie Daniels and Mitch, they treat them as a married couple anyway, for all intents and purposes. They are just a married couple. The way that they interact with each other, the way that they are around each other, they don't act like people that have just met and there's this kind of like sexual tension between them. They act like people that have been around each other for a very long time. And I think that is clearly because at one point it was the Rita Hayworth Rita Hayworth, Jesus. The Annie Hayworth character did fit that mold at one point, I think.
Yeah. Concluding, I suppose, this. I think on a technical level, for the most part, it is a masterwork, but I think it is let down quite a bit, especially in the first half of the film, by its scenario. Yeah. Which I don't think Hitchcock ever really solves. No. He doesn't seem to be able to get around the flaws in the narrative and the shortcomings of the characters.
No, it doesn't seem to be where his interests lie either as a filmmaker. Like, we feel like he's just biding time to get to the birds.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I would agree with you as well that I do think that on a technical level, this film is a masterwork, and I do feel like the second half of the film is a 5 out of 5 film in and of itself. But the first half really just holds it back for me, and I was quite shocked and surprised by how little that first half actually worked for me. And I probably have come across as really quite negative about this film because of that first half, but I really do not want to underplay just how well it does work when this film actually does find its footing, because there is this kind of like oppressive apocalypticness to it that it kind of you take away. It is really tense, and in many ways I do feel like it's set in stone, much like Psycho set up the slasher genre, you know, so many decades before that actually began. And I do feel like in The Birds, we have the beginning of the zombie genre as well. Like,
Yeah.
in many ways, because that central siege is in its finale, that is very much the beginning of what the zombie genre took and kind of ran with.
And I think also it does set up elements of the disaster movie that would be very popular in the early to mid 70s.
Yeah.
As well, there are elements of that. I mean, yeah, there's little bits of everything in there. That I think people have taken from. And I mean, as a positive, I suppose it is better to have a weak first half and a strong second half than the other way around.
Definitely, yeah.
Because at least it goes somewhere rather than starts off well and then just meanders around. It is basically meanders around, then gets more focused. And but yeah, there's no excusing that unfocused first half.
No.
Because it is painfully obvious what it doesn't work.
In many ways, though, just as a segue into another film, in many ways, though, one thing that you can actually say about Birdemic is it is actually quite consistent in terms of its quality throughout.
Yeah, you can't argue with that. It's incredibly consistent.
Yeah.
It's consistently shit, but yeah.
yeah. It's not a good kind of consistent.
Yeah.
But one thing that I do actually want to say about Birdemic before we really get into the film, I want to start on a positive note. And I want to start on a positive note in relation to the birds. Because one single thing that Birdemic does, I won't say better. I refuse to use the word better. But one thing that it does that I think the birds is lacking is that at least its central premise and its characters tie into the story of the birds. That's it. Like the whole eco-thriller thing. Like the main character is an eco-minded individual in the most obvious way possible. And the birds are an eco-threat. That is the end of my positive note. Okay, so Birdemic.
Yeah.
Where do we begin? We've already mentioned this isn't the first time that we've seen Birdemic. How did you find it, Andy, watching it immediately following The Birds?
I actually watched it before The Birds.
Oh my, I wish I had gone around that way. I might have looked more fondly on the first half of The Birds if I had watched Birdemic first.
Yeah, I hadn't seen it for quite a long time since that initial doing the rounds when it kind of became that huge viral thing back in the early 2010s, all those years ago. And I'd seen little bits of it, I think, since, but I think it's one of those things that maybe works better as a communal watch. But watching it on your own, it's fun, but maybe not as fun as it should be.
It becomes a slog after a few minutes. But to be honest, I still found myself laughing, because I like the opening scene as well with the almost like real-time drive. Because I feel like this scene is
opening titles.
Yeah, that is just a man driving with a camera that's off kilt the whole time.
He can't keep that fucking camera still.
No.
It's like he's driving and holding the camera at the same time.
And you have this kind of lazy musical loop, and it's this kind of meandering musical motif that plays over and over again. And every time you think it's over, he stops it for the comic timing.
Oh,
is
it's great.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Because every time you think, oh, it's done now, and he leaves it just enough time for you to think it's over, and then it starts up again.
Yeah.
And it almost, because, like I say, it has that perfect comedy timing of, at first it's funny, then it's annoying, and then it becomes funny again.
Yeah.
And that's where it ends. And it's like, that kind of sums up the film for me, is that it's all unintentional. It's still hilarious, but it's all unintentional. But it is a film that is best viewed as well with a group of people, or like I say, a communal watch. Because watching it on your own, it does get quite tiresome. It does become something of a hard slog to watch, despite the laughs.
There's certain moments that are always going to be incredibly funny, whatever. But then there's those in between parts that are a little bit tough to get through on your own. They're the kind of moments there you'd be like having a little natter with your mates whilst having a beer.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas, when you're just watching it in the cold light of day on your own, it's like, oh, I've got to get through this bit before I can get to the next great bit. But yeah, that opening title it epitomizes the whole film.
Yeah.
The poor sense of timing, the recycling of things, not knowing what makes a good sequence and what should be in a film. The complete incompetence.
And the fact that it comes up as supporting casts.
Yeah.
As if there's, like I said, it's the first film to be made with multiple supporting casts.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that, like, for example, that music clip is about 40 odd seconds long and he uses it about 5 or 6 times. in that opening, and it just comes in and out.
It reminded me of like when you leave a DVD menu on by accident.
And yeah, just the blind incompetence of the whole piece is just something to behold. I mean, I watched that that Vice YouTube documentary just before on like the true story of Birdemic with the Evan Husney and Bobby Hacker and their whole involvement with him and getting that film bought up by Severin Films and the whole 2-year trip they had with him and the aftermath and everything. And there's a bit in that where he's showing them how he created the magic on his Dell computer, and it's like the whole drag and drop clip art thing, because he was showing them how he inserted his digital characters. Yeah. And it was literally just a case of, I dragged and dropped them onto the timeline and look, I can move them about. Look how amazing this is. And I kind of feel like the whole film was like that, where he's just dragged and dropped things without thinking about it properly and thinking it's really novel.
I remembered seeing the trailer. I can't remember. I think it must have been at university, but I remember seeing the trailer for the film. Somebody in one of my classes had showed me. Even at that time, I thought, it looks great. Like, it looks like great, like the type of film that I want to see, like The Room, because The Room was a big thing at the same time. I think that was around about 2009, 2010.
Yeah.
So I find these two films quite synonymous. Like, they make a good double bill as well, if you want to really get into the bad films of that era. But I thought at first, when I'd first seen it, I was like, this must have been made to be intentionally bad, for the CGI to be that bad. There's no way anybody can be that deluded to think that this works. And when you watch that Vice documentary as well, I mean, once you see the actual film, you know that there's certain delusions at play here.
Yeah.
But when you watch that Vice documentary as well, and you see him talk about it, and you see him quite like enthusiastic about it as well, like the way that he did this, the way that, as you mentioned, he worked his magic, you realise that, wow, yeah, he really does believe in this, and it's that belief that sells the whole film. It's that sense of that earnestness. I think the best bad films have to be made this way. They have to be made with no intention to make a bad film. That's why no matter how many Sharknadoes come out, no matter how many giant snake or spider movies comes out, I'm not going to really see them. They're not the type of bad film that I'm looking for. I'm looking for a bad film that feels like there's a vision behind it, a true vision. And Birdemic is a film with a vision. Whether it's good or bad, it's a film with a vision.
Yeah, it's that sincerity that comes through and has lasted until this day. Like the fact that he's still in the belief that he made, in his mind, a good low-budget film, and that he genuinely thought that he was getting offers from Hollywood.
Yeah, we've all been there.
And the whole debacle with Paramount that happened with him announcing that Paramount were going to take him up to make Birdemic 2 and
for $20 million.
And his actual genuine belief in it and genuine upset when it all didn't come to pass for very obvious reasons.
Yeah.
There's even a scene in that Vice documentary when he has a meeting with the agent who tells him to do something else other than the Birdemic, and he's just like, and afterwards he's just like a sulky child.
Yes.
It's kind of bizarre how somebody can be that deluded. And also, I don't know whether there is something going on underneath. I really don't know. Those kind of characters are always kind of going to raise a lot of questions anyway. But
it's like the Neil Breen thing. I mean, and I'm only going to touch upon Neil Breen because that is somebody that I would like to
definitely
really dedicate an entire episode to.
Yeah.
But it's like the Neil Breen thing, where part of it that makes them is that sense of self-belief, that sense of delusion. And as you mentioned, he is a sulky child at the end of it, but at the same time, I don't want to see the version of James and Gwen that the talent agent is saying, you know, you need to go into like making short films. I think anybody really, if they go to the right school, they surround themselves with the right people, they're willing to take on the right information, they can make something approaching a competent like short film or something like that, as long as they're open to that. But it's his pure dedication to that insane vision that he has that I think makes him unique. And it's the same with all these bad films. I don't want to see the competent but mediocre version of these filmmakers. I want to continue to see the earnestly and sincerely bad films that they're going to make.
Yeah.
So I'm almost glad that he walked away from that meeting in a bit of a sulk, because have you seen Birdemic 2, by the way?
I've only seen bits of it. You can tell automatically that it's been the sincerity's been watered down immediately. It's not what Birdemic was.
No, nowhere near. I couldn't get through it. I found it to be unwatchable just simply because it was lacking that. It felt like it was more like a Sharknado film.
Yeah.
And he talks in that Vice documentary about him losing control over a film.
Yeah.
And you can tell it's that he said, I had to make some compromises. That isn't a film that I had control over. You can really see that somebody kind of trampled his vision and made a purposely bad film.
Yeah, it's too self-aware.
Exactly, yeah. At least Birdemic has a great song.
Yeah, I mean, I think as well, like, with the Neil Breens and the James Gwent, I feel that in a way they have more integrity than the Tommy Wiseau's now, because I feel like Tommy Wiseau has kind of cottoned on that people are laughing at him, but you only have to look at that Neighbours sitcom that he made, which is entirely self-aware and awful, intentionally so, that it becomes unwatchable, very much like Birdemic 2. And he's pretty much just cashing in now on that whole aspect. So it's kind of spoilt Tommy Wiseau a little bit, because
it definitely
he's
has.
definitely become far too self-aware.
Yeah.
I mean, I still don't think he quite understands what it is that people like about him, but he's definitely aware of it.
I know it's like, from their point of view, they probably see the laughing at them and their work and their art as being obviously a negative, but it being quite mean. But I do feel like for Tommy Wiseau, there is a desire for him to be in on the joke. Like, he wants to be on the other side of the joke with the rest of the audience.
Yeah.
But to put himself in that position is to really diminish what we want from a Tommy Wiseau film.
Yeah, there's things in this film, but I'm not even sure how technically he even achieved it, because
the magic of cinema,
the magic of the badness, it's like, is unprecedented. I mean, like, for example, like the biggie for me, coming from an audio background, I don't understand how. I get that there's audio cut-offs in between the cuts, but I don't understand the audio cut-offs whilst a clip is showing
within the scene. Yeah.
Has he got a faulty camera or something? Did he shoot the whole film with a busted audio on his camera?
Mm-hmm.
Like, because I don't understand how the audio drops in and out, even when a scene is playing without any cuts.
Yeah.
Because I get that you can have clumsy edits in the audio when there's a shot from a shot, but when a shot's just playing out unadulterated, how the audio can just cut out. It's just
Well, it made me think, like, one of the first things, because I did a film theory course, but I also did a practical filmmaking course as well. And one of the first things that they teach you, even though I don't come from a sound background, when it comes to recording sound, they're like, well, make sure that you do get an ambient track of the environment so that you can put it throughout the entire scene. And then when you have to cut between dialogue pieces, even if you're using the on-set dialogue, it's still going to match the ambient sound, of, like the ambient background sound from the track that you've recorded. And it's like, it's just something as simple as that this film is utterly and completely lacking. Like, that is one of the first lessons that they teach you with recording sound on set. Always make sure you get the ambient.
I mean, the hallmark of an amateur film is usually in the sound department anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, even if it looks half decent, if the sound is rubbish, you can always tell that it's an amateur production.
That would be my first film as well. The sound is fucking shocking.
I mean, this is almost like beyond that.
Yeah.
You do get those amateur films that are made with the in-camera audio and stuff like that, or even like iPhone audio and things like that. But this is like, I don't know what camera he used. It obviously wasn't a very good one anyway.
I think it's one of those like spy cameras that you get in a pen or a button or something like that. It's got a 6 megapixel.
I'd love him to make a film with like an Ari Alexa or something and just completely fuck it up.
Could you imagine?
But
Birdemic, director of photography, Roger Deakins.
That's his goal for Birdemic 3. Sea Eagle.
Sea Eagle.
That's the subtitle. Sea Eagle.
Yeah.
I love how he talks about it. He's completely straight, like that's the title of the film.
See, it was when he mentioned that title and it's the straight faceness of it, and it's like, because out of anybody else's mouth, them saying the name of my third film is Birdemic 3, Sea Eagle. It's instantly like, oh, you know what you're doing.
Yeah.
You know exactly what you're doing. You know how bad this sounds. But when he says it, it's like, it's so sincere. That makes me want to see Sea Eagle.
Yeah.
I mean, it works in two ways as well, because Sea Eagle and Seagull.
And I think also the fact that he's so true to his vision that even when they were making the film, the two leads, Alan Bach and Whitney Moore, were trying to make him let them do their own dialogue. But he was very much adamant that they were going to say every line of his script, even though it was written in broken English. So they had to say it like that.
That Vice documentary, when they mentioned that broken English segment that, you know, they tried, that was like solving a riddle for me. Because the moment that they said that the film was every single character speaking in the same broken English as the director, it suddenly makes sense in terms of like the dialogue that and the way that it's written as well.
And yeah, it seemed like they were kind of like duped into it. I don't know why they didn't just walk off actually. I mean, I think it was just kind of them being nice, and I think also doing it in the knowledge that they thought that no one's going to see this.
Yeah.
I think that it brings up another thing I want to talk about in a minute anyway. The fact that, they tried to get him to like change the dialogue or them adapt it to how people would actually talk, but he wouldn't let them do that. And the fact that like the first 3 weeks they had a crew and then they slowly disappeared to the point where it was just him, I think.
Yeah.
And little things like the fact they had to kill the Becky character off because she basically wanted to go because she was going to drama school.
So they kill her off in like the most unflattering way possible. She's going for a shit.
Yeah.
Like she literally walks into the middle of a field with some toilet roll in her hand, squats down, and then a bird cuts her throat, I think.
Isn't it even in the dialogue that they say she's going for a shit?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I think a boyfriend, Dylan, says.
Yeah. I imagine maybe he did that on purpose. It's like, you've left my film early. I'm going to make you die in a really stupid way. But yeah, it's the fact. I think also the thing as well, like the thing that Whitney Moore said, that when they were wrapping up the shoot, after probably many, many weeks of long weekends, she was excited to never see him again.
There's a great episode of How Did This Get Made with Weird Al Yankovic as a guest as well, and I don't really want to get into another episode of a different show, but they have her on the podcast as well. They introduce her halfway through. It's a live audience one, and one of the things that she does mention during that episode is that her audition, like when she got the job, her audition was in a school parking lot, just like a car park.
Yeah.
And they made her audition for the film there. If you said to me that this was a film in which all of the characters were cast in a school's parking lot, this is that film, definitely.
And there does seem to be a certain degree of like sincerity as to their involvement, because I think they were just under the impression that, I'd like to do some acting in films. This is a film. Okay, it's not great, but I may as well finish it anyway, and no one's going to see it. And it might turn out okay. I could put a little bit of on my reel. That seemed to be the general attitude with these guys, like, because they were obviously thought that the effects were going to be better than they were, and obviously, I imagine they may not have even seen any footage of the film, and obviously like the way it's edited and put together is another part of the badness, other than the dialogue and the performances. I've been involved in film, I mean, not to this level of badness, but I've been involved in films where I just thought this is not what I was sold at all. Like when I actually see the finished film, I did a whole film a couple of years ago where I thought the guy was making Barry Lyndon, and it just ended up being nothing like Barry Lyndon.
Yeah.
It was like...
I have directed films as bad as this. When I was at college, when I was at university, on my second project, I made a first project that really did quite well. And then my second project, the goal was that I had no control over the story or the dialogue, the characters, that type of thing, the thematics or anything. I was just simply allowed to direct it. That was the exercise, really, for myself. And when we turned up on the first day of shooting, a script was written that I didn't get. And on the first day of shooting, I still remember this as clear as day, the cameraman turned around to me and said, "How do I turn it on?" And that was it for me. In my mind, a little tiny explosion happened. And I think I just kind of retreated to some recess. I was like, nope, nobody has ever seen this. It's not available anywhere.
Have I seen it?
Nope.
Oh, right,
No.
I've seen a
show
few.
it to you. Even my family, like the closest people in my life hasn't seen it. In my brain, it just went, well, mwah, like a switch went off and it just went, yeah.
I mean, I think that also as well brings me on to this, something I was thinking about whilst watching the film. Because it has this like reputation, and I think it's more born out of the personality of the director more than the film itself, because I know that there are films that are worse than this. There's got to be films that are worse than this, but I think it's more in the way that it was the general tenacity of the director, his firm belief of getting a deal with this film. Like the fact that, he went round Sundance in a van which was covered in fake blood and birds and handing out flyers, and that's how...
And a sign that said Birdemic that was spelt incorrectly.
Wrong. And that's how he got the attention of those two guys who eventually got him the deal with the Severin Films, which is what caused the whole thing to be a phenomenon anyway. That, I'm sure there's many bad films that don't have that kind of
exposure
person at the helm who has that tenacity and belief. So I'm almost like questioning, this is a very famous bad movie, but is it the worst movie? Because it's like, it's kind of created its own mythology, and I'm like, is it almost giving it a little bit too much credit?
No, I get you, yeah.
There's bound to be other wonders that don't have this kind of platform because of, circumstance and the personalities of the people involved.
I do think that the way that this film came to be as well is like lightning in a bottle.
Yeah.
Because a film this bad, normally, it just becomes a community film. And you can see it as a community film as well. It's been made with a small town with their help kind of thing. You've got people from the local drama groups helping out as well. And because of the amount that it was made for, like under 10 grand, that it's just dealing with a lot of favours there as well. He's talking his way into places and into locations as well to use. Sometimes not always to get the footage he wants, because there are a couple of green screen scenes as well.
Yeah.
In any other world, really, any other scenario, this would just be a film for that community.
Yeah.
And it would become the thing that's talked about for a time, and then it disappears, and it's just something held in these people's lives for forever.
Yeah.
And it is lightning in a bottle that Birdemic has ever been allowed to become the phenomenon that it was, and for us to be able to see it and talk about it today, really.
Yeah.
Like, such a series of circumstances, series of events must have happened for us to it to become this midnight movie, really.
And also, that's like, in terms of like categorizing films, because I do have a hard time categorizing films like this, because I can't really put Birdemic in the same category as The Room, because for all its awfulness, The Room still feels like a legitimate film, if you know what I mean. It's it's shot on film.
I do.
It's made with the capital. It's a $6 million movie.
There are sets,
purportedly, anyway. And it's made more like a legitimate film, whereas this is more of someone's like home movie project, really.
That's it, yeah.
But in their minds, they're making a Hollywood movie, but a low budget one. So it's a completely different mindset, and I have a hard time comparing the two, because even though they keep getting lumped in the same category, I can't, like, is it even a movie? Like, where does that start and end? It's like when you start talking about pieces of art, it's like it gets muddled, if you know what I mean. Like, in terms of, I have to put these into different like tiers, I suppose. It's very difficult. I don't know why I'm so bothered about categorizing bad movies, but you know what I mean? There are different levels to them.
Yeah, definitely. It's like, I think in terms of like the bad movie filmmaking hierarchy, you have at the top, like The Room, which is, I wouldn't say competently made or anything like that, but it's
in the high end of the scale.
I know what you're saying. It is like the high end scale. You can see that there's some at least even minor production value in that film as well. There are sets built. There are I almost said real actors then. But there are sets built, there are people, there's location shooting, there's studio shooting, there's real sound guys and cameras and film used. Birdemic, I would say, is at the bottom of that level, where it's just a home video. And somewhere in between, you have Neil Breen's entire catalogue.
I mean, even Neil Breen, you have like Double Down is almost like completely different to his other films, because it's Double Down's the first one, isn't it? Because that's shot on film. And
that's one where you see his ball sack, isn't it?
But like, for example, that one's shot on film as opposed to the other one's being shot on video. And there's like almost like, I'm not going to say legitimacy to the first one because it's shot on film, but it has a different, more sort of slightly more professional feel than the others that followed.
Yeah.
So yeah, there are different levels to this kind of thing. And I think as technology's moved on, maybe it's become a little bit fuzzier. Mm-hmm. And also, like, I think even like reviewing old bad movies, like where they had to use film, or it was either really bad videotape, there's different levels even then. So yeah, it's difficult to categorize and rank these kind of films.
Okay, Andy, so having now watched Birdemic and The Birds, which would you say is the better of the two?
Oh,
It's a tough choice.
yeah. Because I think they legitimately suffer from the same issues. So,
It's a tough one.
and which
It's a tough
relationship
one.
is the most convincing? I don't know. And which one structurally is more sound?
Like I say, I do think Birdemic is far more consistent.
Yeah, it is definitely.
Competent isn't a word I would use.
I think, yeah, the one way of describing it, I mean, The Birds is a heavily flawed masterwork, and Birdemic is a perfect shit show. You know, one is a perfect film, and the other one is heavily flawed, but in completely different categories.
I think you can describe them both as masterworks, but for completely different reasons.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think it's time to move over to some stats and facts information. I mean, even with Birdemic, we didn't even get to the actual CGI. They have birds that dive bomb that sound like World War II planes that explode on impact.
I think that's one of the greatest jump cuts in history, is that whole sequence where it's like there's about 10 to 15 shots of just stillness.
Yeah.
And then it goes absolutely batshit crazy.
Yeah.
I think the other thing I genuinely love about Birdemic in the second half is the fact that they have this sort of apocalyptic like situation, and yet they didn't even bother to film on roads where it was quiet. They just filmed on main roads where there's just traffic, hoarding in
people
there,
in the background at all times, and
just
stuff like that.
going about their business. It's very much like the Star Wars prequels. When they have the Clone Wars, and then when you get back to Coruscant, there's just people going about their daily business. But there's things in that just wonderful things like that I will always adore, like just the general like incompetence of things like that.
I mean, that's it. I didn't really want to get into a conversation of just like the individual scenes, because I could go through the entire film because there is so much to choose. It's like an embarrassment of riches in terms of like bad movie scenes. And there's so many different parts and aspects of it I can nitpick. But I stopped writing notes halfway through as well and just let it wash over me.
Although there is one thing that I wished was in the film that is not in the film, and I think this is almost like a parallel to The Room. In that scene with the mum, I would have loved for her to have said, "Yes, I definitely have diabetes."
I got the results back from the insulin test.
Oh, and then, "You go, girl."
Yeah.
Oh, I love that. That's one of my favorite. Oh, there's so many great bits. But again, with this, and because we've done this so late, I mean, there's many other things that you can, if you want to see somebody dissect the movie, there's many other ones. So we're not the guys to do that. But I think juxtaposing this with The Birds was our angle anyway. So
it certainly was. And it was a good angle as well. Yeah. So now talking about the stats and facts as well in regards to these two films, there isn't really much for us to get into, but I'll start with The Birds and say that it had a budget of $3.3 million and it made $11.4 million overall. So it turned a profit, but it was also seen as being something of a flop at the time. It didn't quite make the money that a Hitchcock film with his name should pull in.
That's a kind of strange one then as well, because Hitchcock's career did have its ups and downs anyway. I mean, for every Psycho and North by Northwest, you had a Vertigo, which was a huge failure at the time,
and my favourite.
And this is nowhere near like along those. I mean, that was a huge flop.
Yeah.
And then you've got things like Under Capricorn earlier on, which were huge flops as well. So I think this was definitely the start of the downward trajectory, though, because I think after this point, he didn't really have, I think with the exception of Frenzy, any other more successes. I know Marnie was a big failure, and all the films
Frenzy took him like leaving the country to make Frenzy.
Yeah.
Like he could not make it with the same people. He couldn't make it with the same cast as he used to. And he couldn't even make it in the same country.
Yeah.
I mean, Frenzy I could dedicate a whole episode to as well, because it's a much more viscerally grosser film than we're used to from Hitchcock. And it's actually really quite sleazy and horrible. And I like that about the film. But yeah, you can tell it's completely different, and in a way I think that benefits Hitchcock, because he's not falling to a rut with all the same people, the same studio and that type of thing. Like it's forcing him to do things a little bit differently.
I mean, the Frenzy is like Hitchcock trying to modernize for the 70s, but I think The Birds is Yeah, it's only genuinely seen as a failure as a follow-up to Psycho.
Absolutely.
And that was the trap that he was falling into anyway at that point, where he was just sort of almost competing with himself.
But I will say that the critics' consensus, although I read on Wikipedia that it was mixed at the time, overall now it has a 95% rating on Rotten Tomatoes with a really high average rating of 8.2. And the consensus is that, proving once again that the build-up is key to suspense, Alfred Hitchcock successfully turned birds into some of the most terrifying villains in horror history. Now, I certainly agree with the latter half of that consensus, but I don't think the build-up worked for me. I think the individual scenes in the latter half of the film really work. But even though I will say with all of the criticisms that I've had, I completely understand why it's regarded as a masterwork, especially how shocking it must have been to seen it back then as well. And for my critics review, I've once more gone to Empire magazine, and this is Angie Arrigo, and her review is: a mysterious army of enemies with no suggested motive, and what's worse, they're your friendly guarding crows. It clamps itself to your recollection and doesn't let go. And she gave it 5 out of 5, and that was one of the Empire essays as well. I would recommend reading that. It's a good go as well. And the audience score for The Birds is 83%, so slightly below, with an average rating of 3.96 out of 5. And the IMDb score as well, just to bolster that, is 7.7 out of 10. So really, it's high ratings all round for that particular film as well.
I'd say that IMDb is actually probably close to what I would put it as.
Same, I was going to say, but for me, I would say it's a 7 out of 10 film.
Yeah.
Anyway, moving on to Birdemic. There's not really much to go on with this film as well because of the low budget nature of it as well. Although it has exposure as a midnight movie, it's not really exactly the film that's going to open to 4,000 screens or something like that. So its budget was $10,000 or below. And the box office overall, we do not have a figure for, but I imagine it's been something of a success in terms of home video because, well, it's got released across many different countries for people much like ourselves that enjoy the communal watching of these type of films. And on Rotten Tomatoes, moving over to the critics' response, it has the high score, very high score, of 18%. And that is a 2.55 average rating out of 10. There's no consensus because it's only something like 20 reviews, not even that. But I did pick a critic review from Variety, and this is a very positive one. And it says, howlingly bad films are a dime a dozen, but the evident Ed Wood-like sincerity with which writer-director James Nguyen lovingly crafted this compendium of cinematic don'ts gives it a goofy, almost surrealist charm. And I 100% agree. And the audience score is 26% with a 1.83 out of 5 rating. And the IMDb score, because I do think this film is in the bottom 250, is 1.8 out of 10. Which is got to be right down there.
I think it's in the bottom 5.
Holy moly. Yeah. So, Andy, any final thoughts for these films?
And you know what? I'm actually quite surprised that it is so low because a lot of the times these ratings are based on not just the quality of the film, but their entertainment factor. So
yeah,
it does puzzle me somewhat as to why certain audience scores are so low as well, actually. I'd expect the audience score to actually be higher.
Yeah, I understand that it's not a good film, but it's certainly an enjoyable watch, but under the right circumstances, and especially because of the kind of midnight movie following this film had as well. I would say if we were rating by entertainment value alone, then yes, the score should be higher, but I can completely understand why it has the rating that it does.
I don't understand why we're legitimately calling it out on the rating.
Okay, so that has been our The Birds and Birdemic review today. I hope you've very much enjoyed that. Join us next week when we'll be actually doing things even more differently, as we won't be discussing one particular film, but discussing a whole host of films. It's one of the first of what we would call our topic shows, our topic-led episodes. And for this topic, we're actually going to be discussing the realm of Disney live-action remakes. So you're speaking about films like Beauty and the Beast, The Lion King, Aladdin, but all of the lesser versions of those.
Yeah.
And we'll actually be joined by a special guest, Aidan Bellazur. I'm sure it's going to be a good old time for us to really get our teeth and claws into these films. I know that you've been really enjoying your rewatch of these films.
I've been thoroughly researching by watching the originals and then the remakes. It's been, yeah.
It should prove to be quite an experience.
Yeah.
But until then, it's caw from me. That's actually pretty good.
Yeah.
And that was Andy. Thank you for listening.